Okay, we can do something else, so.
All right, well, we will allow Elizabeth to open us in prayer this morning. And she'll speak loudly so that the camera will pick us up.
Dear Lord, be with us as we explore your word. Help us to always remain faithful, keeping our eyes upon you, recognizing that you are always in control. Help us to always do your will. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, if you remember where we were last month, we were talking about the church in the colonial era in America. And one of the things we talked about was that there was mainly in the United States settlement by British interests, that the Spanish were in the south in places like Florida, that the French were strictly in the north in Quebec. One of the intolerable acts of Parliament in 1774 that brought about even more of a reaction in the colonies was the Quebec Act that basically put everything west of the Alleghenies and allocated it to the French. And so the colonists thought they were being surrounded, and there was a significant anti-Catholic element involved there. We also talked about the fact that we did not see in the beginning, in colonial era, a significant presence of immigration or the establishment of colonies, certainly by Nordic powers, by the Germans, by the Russians, by the Italians, by pretty much anybody else. It was pretty much a British, French, Spanish deal. Now, this is actually going to affect what we're talking about this week, so let's explore it for a minute. Why would that be that we would not see continental powers outside of the French, the Spanish, and actually the Dutch being particularly active in North America?
They have to do with access to waterways to get there? I mean,
Exactly. It's a maritime power issue. If you look at the problem that goes on, well, first of all, the other powers are more focused on continental power jockeying because they've got exposed borders. But even if they do want to get out, they've got to get around the British Isles, if they're the German Navy, for example, which becomes a problem for them in 2 world wars. The Sultan of Morocco does try to cut a deal with Cromwell's government to ally with the British to attack Spanish interests in the Americas, basically saying, I'll provide a lot of troops, you provide the ships. Sultan does not have the shipbuilding technology or necessarily the timber, but the British turned that deal down. They don't need another rival in the Americas, and there's some, remnant there that says, let's not ally with Saracens, in effect. Now, in our own day and age, we see, for example, that we still have the same sort of maritime policy issues. The reason the Chinese are so furiously building naval bases and a navy relates to how they can control seaways and project power. They have in recent memory of the Imperial Japanese Navy strangling them, and they don't want to be dependent just on the U.S. Navy. They have now established naval bases on the Horn of Africa and on the west coast of Africa. And the American Navy does not become a power until basically the turn of the last century. And at that point, it's not so much a question of establishing colonies as sort of coaling bases. Spanish-American War allows us to establish a Pacific presence in the Philippines. But here we are, and so we have principally a mix of British and Dutch Protestants, with French Catholics to the north of them, and a small presence of Spanish Catholics to the south of them. So we have all of the ingredients here for sort of a climate of the building of a Protestant empire. This is the era of somewhat in-your-face Protestantism out of England and out of Holland. And at the same time as we saw in our review of pietism, last month, there is a series of waves of revival going forth throughout the broader Christian consciousness. And we call this the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening basically is something that proceeds in waves throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, fueled by evangelical preaching. A distinctive feature of the Christian faith in America is an emphasis on individual response. That is going to remain an identifying feature of American Christianity throughout all history. Most of the people remember who came here. Yes, we did have the proprietors and the Prince Ruperts and things like that, but most of the people who came here were getting away from something else. And so they were much more focused on what they were going to do and a frontier sensibility of not being under the authority of somebody else. Now, we've got, therefore, an American heritage of separatism. We had all the folks show up into New England, not so much as Puritans, but as separatists who were saying they wanted to establish a separate theocracy, a city on a hill. An American heritage of dissent, an American heritage of pioneering and the influence of pietism we talked about. The pietistic influence is going to be the dominant influence in preaching. And so that's why Methodism really takes off in the U.S. We're going to see later this becomes sort of a camp meeting atmosphere. You've got meetings that go on for 3 or 4 days, with thousands of people attending in open-air preaching centers. Think of the sorts of revivals we have had in the 20th and 21st century. The big, Billy Graham revivals, the big Azusa Street Temple Pentecostal movement out of Los Angeles, the big TV revivals we've seen. They get their start in the Great Awakenings, and they get their start in these big camp meetings. So right now we're just kind of reviewing a lot of stuff in the 19th century climate. At this point in the American colonies, the Roman Catholic presence is marginal. And as we form a nation, the Roman Catholic presence will remain marginal until we start seeing mass immigration. We also have the rise of Romanticism as a cultural movement. Romanticism would be a movement we would see in art, in music, in literature. And it is an emphasis, first of all, on going back to roots. There's an interest in things like medieval knights and, we get Byron writing about the Joueur and others. We get an emphasis at the same time on the idea of transcendence. Now, when is this arising? If we think of the poetry of Goethe or Schiller or somebody like that, this is sort of in the midst of and post-Enlightenment phenomenon. So if you think of the Enlightenment as reaching its, I'm going to choose my words carefully, as reaching its apogee in a somewhat dysfunctional sense in the cult of reason of the French Revolution. It's all up to us, and we just deconstruct everything. There's a reaction, and people want to look at something that's beyond themselves.
What's that apogee?
Highest point. So there's a reaction, and the Romantic movement sets in. We get Byron, we get Goethe, we get Schiller, we get the heroic subjects in painting, we get Beethoven's Ode to Joy in the Ninth Symphony, we get all of the music of Hector Berlioz, we get all of these things that will become markers of a lot of the 19th century. There's a fascination with the Gothic. We get Frankenstein written by Mary Shelley. That sort of cult of the transcendent outside of the church starts coming back into the church. Painting with extremely broad brush here. If we look inside the Church of England or inside the Dutch Calvinistic churches, they're kind of cut and dried. It's all about going through the motions of prayer and the code of conduct of how you're supposed to live. Full stop. There are certainly exceptions. If you look at the Roman Catholic Church, that's more about showing up at specific times and places and being somewhat of a spectator while people go through the motions of a Mass and doing your duty in confession once a year. Obviously, there are exceptions there. But how people connect with the idea of Spirit, how people connect with the experience of Spirit is not an emphasis in the established churches of the time. They're going to have to go through their own renaissance. And so the romantic movement that's swirling around them outside starts coming into the church. People start going back and looking back at roots. Where did this come from? How do we go back and look at what the church fathers did? Self-reliance. Well, in America, this form of romanticism can take the form of self-reliance or of transcendentalism, which becomes Orthodox faith. We talked last time about the cult of self-reliance, saying Ralph Waldo Emerson. And we talked about how transcendentalism basically morphs into an Orthodox Catholic faith, actually, in the person of Orestes Brownson, and how he becomes a leading philosopher in 19th century America. Now, this American contrast or tension between individualism and a focus on the transcendental will remain an identifier of American Christianity to our day. And so it's still very much about me in most Christians' minds in America. That's become more consumer focus as we've gotten to the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century. But there's still that idea of being spiritual. And so we have the whole movement of spiritual but not religious, the nuns out there, not affiliated with any particular church. We see in that overall context, again, still reviewing here, that a Catholic identity arises which is independent of hereditary identity and formation. So we get the whole Anglo-Catholic movement arising with people reaching for the transcendental. We see that this Catholic identity will be founded upon a rediscovery of individual faith response set in motion through pietism. So if you recall, when we looked at Methodism, we realized that the Anglo-Catholic movement, the Oxford movement, would not have been possible except for the Methodists. That idea of individual response is where the original ritualists in the Oxford movement are going. Their individual response happens to be very focused on the sacraments and liturgy. But until you get that idea of individual response, it's hard to see the Anglo-Catholic movement arising on its own at that time. So these movements kind of weave between each other, and the pendulum is always swinging, right? The Anglo-Catholic movement is very much countercultural, and proudly so. We had the stages in the development of the Anglo-Catholic movement, starting out with study in a university setting where people are going back and looking at church fathers. Then there's a focus on ritual and the beauty of holiness. And then there's a focus on hard work. And the original Anglo-Catholic priests are slum priests who work themselves to death. We saw these phases of development. If we say these are in parallel to the stages of development. Academia, then parishes, then a life of service. An emphasis on the beauty of holiness and a concern with social order. Now that's where we got last month, talking about the influences in colonial America, the rise of Pietism, Methodism, and the rise of Anglo-Catholicism. That's sort of the overall climate we're going to be proceeding now in looking at Anglicanism in the 19th century. So before we proceed, are there particular questions about that?
So there's also geographical, where the pendulum happens to be.
Yes, and so one of the things we talked about last month was the fact that the sort of pietistic preaching and evangelical preaching does not take place in those locations where the church in America has been more established. And so you don't see people running around having open-air prayer meetings so much in Massachusetts. You don't see this in Virginia. It tends to be more of a frontier phenomenon. You don't see it in Pennsylvania because the different religious parties in Pennsylvania are more aligned with ethnic identity. German Lutherans here, German Mennonites here, Quakers in Philadelphia, things of that sort. The Anglican Church, to the extent that it exists and is established in Virginia and sort of desultory efforts in the Carolinas and parts of Georgia, is really a moribund social structure that is focused around a plantation economy. So a church is more, you provide a chaplain for a plantation and he says prayers occasionally, but nobody has to do anything. And so you do see waves of evangelical preaching proceed down through the Carolinas and Georgia, but that's in reaction basically to the so-called established church being kind of a vacuum there. It is more of a frontier thing, though. New York is not responsive to the evangelical preaching because even then it's basically considered a-religious. Just a pluralistic society where anything goes. And the Puritans out on Long Island that scandalized about New York as Sodom and Gomorrah and things like that. When New York is going to change is when it gets mass immigration. And then it'll become a much more Catholic or Jewish identity, depending on what decade we're looking at. So here we are. That's kind of just your basic overall, what was the stage. But we have to talk about the stage also for Anglicanism in the sense of what's happening in the Roman Catholic Church in America. Now, as I said, the presence of the Catholics was marginal. They'd actually been here longer than anybody else. If you think of the French Jesuits running around, or if you think of the Spaniards in the South. But their presence was marginal and then was further marginalized by the British triumph of 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War, or what we would call the French and Indian War, which extended British rule over areas which had been under French or Spanish rule. There was a vicar apostolic with jurisdiction over the colonies, but he was based in Europe. He did appeal for a bishop to be sent to America. You'll recall when we talked last week about Anglicanism in America, how there was a huge resistance to having a bishop. And we had that cartoon of the attempt to land a bishop in New England. Now, let's think about this for a minute. The Catholic efforts in mission that have taken place up until this point in the world have been aligned principally with Spanish, Portuguese, or French expeditions to establish empire. And they generally took priests with them. And they're generally religious priests. You don't get secular priests yet because they're in the diocese. You get Franciscans, you get Dominicans, some Premonstratensians, but pretty much you don't see any secular diocesan structure. So that means that in terms of how missionaries are going to be in a given territory, there's a little jockeying between religious orders, the Vatican, and whatever crown is involved. Complicated very much by European power politics.
What year was the mission supposed to be?
That's the suppression of the Jesuit missions in South America, in Paraguay and Argentina. And that is a late 18th century phenomenon. I can't give you a particular...
So about the same time.
Yeah, but it's about the same time that the Pope divides the New World between the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Jesuits are right in the mix of that. The Jesuits come to be considered sort of a phalanx for the Vatican. And there's enough of a pushback that they are eventually officially suppressed. The Society of Jesus is disestablished in effect, and we're going to, well, in 1773 we'll get there. And so the Jesuit priests in North America become secular priests. Now the Society of Jesus will be reestablished in 1810. And so it's not like the Jesuit effort really ever goes away. There is no Society of Jesus there for 37 years. The fact that there is an appeal for a bishop is resisted by the Jesuits, because they're the ones who are out in North America. And they view anybody who's going to be sent from the Vatican as a bishop as somebody who's going to try to suppress them. Have you ever seen the movie Black Robe? That's about French Jesuits running around with the Native Americans in, well, this part of the world, amongst other places. Came out in the 80s, I highly recommend it. As I say, in 1773, the Society of Jesus was suppressed. The Jesuits in North America became secular priests under the authority of the Vicar Apostolic. Now, what does that mean? He's still in London, or still in Europe. And so they're pretty much on their own. And American Catholicism, even though there's no organized presence, is mainly influenced by these Jesuit priests who become secular priests. Now, what have the Jesuits always been focused on? Education, right? So you start seeing a focus on the building of schools and the education of people. We see a Catholic presence centered mainly in Maryland, which was founded explicitly as a colony or proprietorship tolerant of Catholics under a Catholic proprietor or Calvert. You see Catholics tolerated in Pennsylvania. We get this sort of post-Revolutionary War period going on. It's one of internal organization. Most prominent figure here being John Carroll, who does become the first bishop in America, consecrated in Baltimore in 1790. The high school that was our big rival in football, the sort of crowning championship thing would be between the Public League and the Catholic League in Philadelphia. That would be somebody like Radnor or Lower Merion versus Archbishop Carroll High School. Because the original archdiocese of Baltimore, of course, went way up into Pennsylvania. Baltimore is the original seat of Catholicism in America, in the United States, that is. If you discount the Spanish missions that are older in California, places like that. But Baltimore is sort of the original seat and is still active in a lot of the wider Catholic Church in America. So, for example, when we lived in Mississippi, most Catholic churches in the northern half of the state did not have resident priests. They would either have priests from the Glen Mary Home Missioners who would ride circuit. They were mainly Irish guys back in the day. Now they're from Nigeria or El Salvador. The Glen Marys have actually withdrawn. Or they would be there from the American Board of Negro and Indian Missions, which was an entity of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. And so that's the original sea city for America that still has how funding got established and people were sent out and are still sent out to places. John Carroll succeeded in establishing a real increase in priests in America, working with French priests, the Sulpicians. Now, why might that have been the case?
Who are the Sulpicians?
It's another religious order that was centered on the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. Also considered a teaching order. Why would he be working with French Sulpicians? Well, there is no Society of Jesus. But he's used to working with French priests. And he's used to working with a teaching order. So go find another French teaching order. Now, bear in mind what's going on in France at the same time. The French Revolution. how many of the priests in France are going to want to get out of France, right? I mean, 10,000 of them are killed, 30,000 are exiled. I mean, things are not good for the Catholic Church in France. So maybe going to North America isn't your worst option. So he establishes a seminary within a year of the diocese being established in Baltimore. The professor of homiletics at that seminary was a concelebrant at a wedding that Elizabeth and I attended for her younger brother at one of the oldest Anglican churches in Baltimore. And he was a guy who looked just like Dr. Kildare. Remember the old young Dr. Kildare when he walked in? He was this professor of homiletics. Before your time, okay? Way before your time. TV show in the early 60s, okay. So we get a seminary established in Baltimore, and then we get Georgetown University, 1791. Notice Georgetown is established as a Jesuit institution. How's that happen if they've been suppressed?
Yeah.
Well, they do it because they're overseas. They just act like the Society of Jesus, even though they don't have a Vatican charter at that point. They'll be formally rechartered in 1810.
Now, Harvard was originally set up to teach priests, but not Jesuit. It was something else.
Harvard was set up to teach basically Calvinist ministers.
Oh, okay.
Yes, in the colony of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We get St. Elizabeth Seton. Our school is named after that here. She's a convert from Anglicanism, and she establishes a teaching order of Catholic religious in 1809. So that's the first time we start seeing an order established in the colonies, or now the United States. So from the get-go here, between the Jesuits and St. Elizabeth Seton, we see a Catholic focus on education, Catholic focus on schools. That's going to be a really good groundwork for them when they do get mass Catholic immigration from Ireland, Germany, and Italy. By the time Baltimore was established as a metropolitan see, in other words, by the time it's raised to the level of archdiocese, there were probably about 80 Catholic churches in America, 70 priests, and 70,000 church members. Episcopal sees were established in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Now, we don't have any numbers here for Louisiana.
We're still under.
Louisiana is a French presence, and so I've kind of excluded them here from what's going on in colonial America, because they're not part of colonial America yet. Dave?
Before it goes away entirely, before we leave this page, John Carroll was also immortalized in the song Maryland, My Maryland.
Maryland, My Maryland. Dale is telling us that John Carroll is immortalized in the song for the state.
As well as the Despot's Heel.
Okay, all right.
But
You had a question, Michelle.
No, this is new. I guess I've only paid attention to Lutheran immigration and Anglican immigration. I didn't realize the Romans didn't come in.
It's a mass immigration phenomenon principally in the 19th century. They're not really part of the scene in colonial America, with exceptions, obviously, but 70,000 people is
Angela's
not.
ashes.
Yeah, but I didn't realize that the Roman Church wasn't here in colonial times. It didn't ever dawn on me.
Oh,
It was here, but.
it was here, but very marginal, and there was very much a move against it. I mean, when people freaked out with the Quebec Act, was we're going to be surrounded by Catholics on our western border. They're considered the enemy by most of the colonialists.
Well, because they all came as Protestant refugees.
Pretty much, yeah. So Louisiana just parked to one side. That's always pretty much been a Catholic enclave in America, but it's not part of the broader church mix in the period we're talking
Spanish
about.
and French.
Spanish and French, yes.
The subject.
Now, which takes us to the next phase of this, Irish immigration. Here's where things change. Well, Irish immigration was always a factor, but if you recall in colonial times, most of the Irish who came over were Scotch-Irish from Ulster. So they were like firm Calvinists, right? Now, post-1820, it starts to expand and then explodes in 1847, the famine year. The potato crop fails between 1845 and 1847, and a lot of people start dying. You get 200,000 Irish arriving in the decade of the 1830s, but by 200,000 in the 30s, and then 780,000 in the 3-year period of the famine.
Look, they survived them Guinness.
Well, yeah. By 1860, there'll be 1.6 million Irish in America. They're principally going to be on the eastern seaboard because that's where you land at this point. Many of them will start making their ways to the frontier. By the time Lincoln is raising the Union Army, you'll see a lot of Irish in the Army because that's your only option when you get off the boat. Although it will be the Irish gangs in New York City that are the principal actors in the draft riots of 1863. Gangs of New York, the movie with Daniel Day-Lewis, and yeah, the riots were that big, and yes, the army did fire on everybody in the city, so we had a different way of handling riots back then. There's tension between Irish and German Catholic communities, and that's going to remain throughout the 19th century. In fact, that's going to be a feature of Catholicism in a lot of America, that things become somewhat ethnically identified at a parish level. When we lived in Rochester, New York, I remember going up to the north side of the city, and I could see 4 really big Catholic churches within like a half-mile radius. You could just see them looking at each other, and I kind of asked, like, are all those churches Catholic? I said, that's the German church, that's the Irish church, that's the Italian church, and that's the Polish church. Now they're all Hispanic, of course.
Same in Chicago, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty much true in a lot of cities, and a lot of them are not Hispanic churches anyway.
Well, it came to here too.
Mm-hmm.
Cyril and Methodius is essentially
Slovenian, yeah.
Slovenian church.
Yeah, if you look at the inscription on St. Cyril and Methodius on the outside of the building, it's in Slovenia. We get some tension that gets exacerbated here, because who's the old Catholic hierarchy in America? They're French.
Oh, yeah.
They're the ones who started all this. And so as people are being made seminary professors and monsignors and bishops, they're French. They don't want to deal with the Irish. So you get some more tension there about who's going to do what in what hierarchy. Then, of course, you get a wave of Italian immigrants. That's focused initially on the coasts. The Irish and the Germans become very prominent in westward expansion. If you go to the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn, pretty much most of the cavalry troop is either Irish or German. A lot of them do not speak English. The bugler is an Italian who speaks very little English. He's the only one who survives because he's given a message to go back. Dies in 1912 in New York City. One of the Irishmen who is killed at Little Bighorn is a survivor of the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. So he obviously has got some stars crossed on his path in terms of cavalry engagements. But now, we're seeing, sort of waves of ethnicity come through here. And where's the Vatican in all this? Well, the Vatican, the Roman Curia, is basically at some distance because the American experience is one more of multiculturalism, pluralistic, and individual society, well into the 20th century. The Roman Curia at this time has kind of looked more inward. They have survived a number of revolutions in Europe. They've been attacked in the French Revolution. They've had various problems in the year 1848, certainly with the other upheavals on the European continent. Of course, they've been officially suppressed in the British Isles. The disability of Catholicism for British subject isn't formally removed until 1841. And they have kind of looked more inward and are reacting more to what is known as modernism. And so what we would think of just as, say, higher critical approach to the Bible, the Vatican's doubled down on being traditionalist. And they're not really looking at what is happening in America. The net result of all this is that the American Catholic Church tends to develop its own identity early, and still has one, and still is always a little bit not on the same page with the Vatican. Catholic identity in America becomes much more associated with Americanism and patriotism. Catholic identity in America is less hostile to modernism and political liberalism. Pius IX's encyclical Syllabus of Errors is sort of sold to the American Catholic population as really not being that bad about democracy or modernism. You have a question?
In Canada, with the large French presence, was there the same revolt as was happening in France against the Catholic Church? And so then, you know, we talk about a lot of the people coming from Europe, but are we seeing any Catholics come down from Canada?
No, and that's because the French Revolution is restricted to France. Quebec is under British rule.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay.
Quebec is under British rule, so the political upheaval that happens in France does not happen in Quebec. There's no organized attack on the church.
Oh, okay. So is this a similar presence or the characteristics that you're talking about here of the Roman Catholic Church in the U.S. similar to Canada or different or?
Very different.
Okay.
Quebec is a totally different Catholic identity that is an hereditary Catholic identity focused on French heredity as well.
Oh, okay.
So the sort of plural, multicultural American Catholic identity is completely foreign to Quebec.
Okay.
It's a
Limited to French.
Anglophone North American phenomenon. It's not part of Spanish-speaking Catholicism. It's not part of French-speaking Catholicism. The Syllabus of Errors, this is basically an encyclical that goes through developments in modern thought and philosophy and science and everything and criticizes them. And so it's rather hostile to what's happening post-1848. We get all these revolutions in the continent trying to establish more popular forms of government. The church kind of doubles down with being allied with the monarchy. Well, that's a tough sell in America. And so the Catholic Church in America is trying to position itself as not being allied with, you know, a repressive monarchical institution, which is the way the Vatican is perceived by many Americans. And so there's this explanation of the Syllabus of Errors. But by the 1860s, there are 3 million Catholics in America. The only organized hostility is in Missouri, where the church is denied the right to own property. Square that one with the U.S. Constitution. Well, of course, it eventually gets declared unconstitutional, but that's the rule in Missouri for a while. The church, the Catholic Church in Europe, is used to being either in the majority, allied with the state, or excluded from a hostile state. Now it has to adjust to being in minority position in a pluralistic society that has no established church.
Still adjusting.
And it's still adjusting, right, as are all churches. The church, partly as a result of who the immigrants are, quickly becomes a champion of democracy and social justice. Protestant conversions to Catholicism result because of this focus on democracy and social justice. So we saw the example of St. Elizabeth's Seat. Questions on Roman Catholicism before we move on. Give you a couple pictures here. There's a picture of Archbishop Carroll, Archbishop of Baltimore, and on the right I've given you a Thomas Nast cartoon. And notice this is from the 1870s, not the 1840s. And this is the American image of an Irishman. Right? You know, this is when you could see in a saloon in New York City a sign like "No Dogs or Irishmen." You can perhaps see on your own copy what's on the background there, but he's sitting on a gunpowder keg. He's got a bottle of whiskey and a firebrand. And of course, in the background, we see things, you know, that, well, really aren't legible, but that is the image. And so you can also find at the time in New York newspapers ads for, you know, a good strong boy wanted to work in a stable must be able to read and write some. No Irish need apply. You know, pious girl needed to help family attend to children. No Irish need apply. If you think of our, you know, civil rights era in the American South and the image of blacks in the American South, this is where the Irish are in the 1840s, well, through the 19th century. There'll be, we get successive waves of immigrants and people start at different parts on the ladder and then establish themselves. So you get the Irish, you get the Italians, you get the Jews, you know, and how we result in a pluralistic society comes out of this. Now, we're going to press on until 10 and then we'll take a break. So let's look at the sort of mix we're in the midst of here, this milieu.
What's a milieu?
A mixture, a hodgepodge. As we see in the convergence of Catholic and American identities, America becomes a nation with a unique religious sensibility. It's different from other countries at a religious level. We get what is called the national period. That would be the period from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War. And a climate of public opinion emerges which is founded upon the image of the free individual having full opportunity to develop his or her potential and talent. The individual and society are perfectible. Therefore, our focus has to be on removing restrictions. In other words, we can figure this out, we can work this out, we can make the better society, and I can make myself a better person. Democracy, therefore, is about freedom, but requires that we focus on the perfectibility of society and individuals. So we have to focus on progress and equality. A lot of these themes are going to sound familiar in 21st century America. There is an atmosphere of paternalism and voluntarism. In other words, we have to do things and we have to persuade other people to participate in this progress, but to the extent that we can't really persuade them, we kind of have to set the rules anyway, because we know what's best for them. Again, sound familiar? Freedom and democracy, these civic values, become linked with evangelicalism, that Protestant identity as a sort of national religion. And so we get this American religious nationalism. This is where you get the sensibility that is still current in many parts of the American church that America was founded, or is at some point then, a Christian nation. We get a common social grammar that evolves. evolves based on common religious principles. Now, in the 20th century, this is going to be called Army Protestant. You know, Dale's been an Army officer over here, and he can testify to the fact that if a chaplain steps up and starts talking about something, there's sort of a core set of Christian norms and values and patriotism and identity that gets talked about. You don't hear a lot about personal conversion. You don't hear a lot about sacramental theology. You don't hear a lot of biblical criticism and discussion. It's more about what kind of person you're called to be. So what we would call in the 20th century Army Protestant is just kind of a national religion that evolves in the 19th century in America. Revivalism, as I said, becomes important, but revivalism basically replaces establishment in maintaining moral order. There is no established church. And so it's a little bit more in your face from individuals, whether or not the preacher is talking to you or somebody who's part of the tent meeting or part of the local church is saying you're part of the established order or not. The church is both viewed and experienced as a means to establish moral order on the frontier. You're out in some cow town and people are shooting up Dodge City. What happens? Then a preacher shows up and the good folks start building a church and the town starts evolving. Think of all the westerns you've seen where, unless it's Clint Eastwood showing up as a preacher who's going to kill everybody, it's, you know, things change. When there's a gun battle in an old western, where do the good town folk flee?
The church.
To the church that's up on a hill outside the town.
And the remake of Magnificent Seven
Right.
is centered around the Rose Creek's church, and these bad guys come in, and that's like the one thing they destroy is they burn down this church. It's kind of like we're in control now of the town.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the Free Grazers and what's the Robert Duvall, Kevin Costner movie?
Open Range.
Open Range. When the big gun battle, you know, everybody's going up the hill to the church, you know, that's the image. But there's some reality behind that image. This evangelical preaching focus is moving out to the frontier and establishing some veneer of order. By the last quarter of the 19th century, now here's where we're focusing back on ourselves, the Episcopal Church image is one of stability and primitive roots. The Episcopal Church image at the beginning of the 19th century is one where others view the Episcopal Church with suspicion because it's identified with an English identity, with the crown, remember when we had our first convention of the Episcopal Church, General Convention in 1786, Bishop White kept the 4th of July off the church calendar in recognition of the fact that about half of the Anglican priests in America had left when the colonies won the war. They went to Nova Scotia, they went to Atlantic Canada, or they went back to England. Some of them were run out of town on the rail. You know, I mean, there was a lot of, you know, it wasn't all pretty. The 4th of July doesn't get put back on the Episcopal Church's calendar until 1928.
In 1963 in Vicksburg.
Yeah, well, that's Mississippi, right? The 4th of July finally gets celebrated in 1963, right? Vicksburg fell on the 4th of July. Gettysburg was on the 4th of July. I mean, there were twin disasters in 1863 for the Confederates.
There will be people tomorrow that say that there's a reason why Charleston is getting clobbered by that hurricane.
I'm sure there'll be people who say that, yeah.
Did the Episcopal Shield in Mississippi have the rebel in the corners of the blue cross?
No. No, there's never been the Confederate battle flag on a diocesan seal. You can find the Confederate battle flag in the windows of a number of churches, and there's dispute over that, for example, at the National Cathedral right now. And so if the church is viewed as a means to establish moral order. There's a sense of belonging to that order, which is linked with church membership. And so the Episcopal Church now, being more identified with stability and primitive roots, is more about belonging, right? You're becoming part of the establishment. But that gets shattered by the second ritualist controversy. What was the first one? Well, that was the whole Oxford movement. The second one is John Henry Hopkins, 1867, The Law of Ritualism. And he basically is doing a lot of the stuff that the Anglo-Catholics were doing and saying, well, we really do need to focus more on the Eucharist, etc., etc. And 28 bishops publicly condemn the book. What they condemn are candles on the altar. Remember Deacon, that's going to be an issue. The use of incense, reverence to the altar, and Eucharistic vestments. So wearing a chasuble.
We're going to have.
Right. Wearing a chasuble, using incense, bowing to the altar, having candles. These are the things that Hopkins is talking about in his book. And this is going to be the sort of brouhaha in which, in the ensuing decade, we'll see one part of the Episcopal Church split off and form the Reformed Episcopal Church. And we're going to see James Deacon denied consecration as a bishop. Yes?
Is the opposition similar to like the opposition to icons well earlier in the church with the icon?
The iconoclastic controversy? Well, yeah, you can see some parallels there. If you go back to the original iconoclastic controversy in the 7th and 8th centuries in the Eastern Church, you've got the issue that you really can't have an icon. You know, that this is a graven image prohibited by the Ten Commandments. There are those who argue that the policy adopted by the Emperor Leo the Isaurian to suppress icons is basically how he's trying to manage his border wars with Islam. Eventually, at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, icons will be declared okay, but if you actually read the Acts of the Second Council of Nicaea, it's really not about icons. It's an issue of Christology. And so what Leo is saying is you can't have an icon anyway because you're encompassing God, who is infinite, in an image. And so the issue becomes, how is the person of Christ revealed to us? And it really turns around the definition of the Greek word prosopon, which we would translate as face or visage in the sense of a showing. That, yes, we cannot encompass the infinitude of God in any representation, but God chooses to show himself to us in the person of Jesus Christ. And we can capture how he chooses to show himself to us as a window into an alternate reality.
Is that part of the opposition here, or is this mostly?
Well, I'm building the case there. I'm building the case. So that's where we first get iconoclasm. Then when we get to the Reformation, the Calvinists in both Switzerland and France, and then in the British Isles, the Puritans, are very much, let's destroy statues, let's destroy windows, let's focus on what we consider a Presbyterian look of a white church and nothing else. And that is the same sort of idea that this is a graven image, and since it has developed out of the tradition, capital T, of the church, it doesn't fall within the overarching rubric of sola scriptura, that our faith has to be based on the Bible only. We can't have any of these traditions out here. So same effect, slightly different calculus. The first iconoclastic controversy in the Eastern Church is more about the intersection of the personhood of Christ with the biblical prescription of images. The second iconoclastic controversy in the Reformation is more about all these other things are accretions in tradition, capital T, and we don't recognize tradition, we only recognize Scripture. That is going to be the springboard for the sort of iconoclasm that remains in the American church, that when the first ritualist controversy of the Oxford movement starts and the second ritualist controversy of John Henry Hopkins starts, it's really a Reformation thing. It's not the original iconoclastic thing. So it's really about the Bible, the Bible, the Bible. Where there is some flexibility there, and it's because of the prayer book and all of the battles that were fought over the prayer book in the 16th and 17th centuries, including literal battles. There are things like the creed in the prayer book. There is a Eucharistic prayer. There are all these things that we can trace to Scripture, but of course the creed you don't find in any book of the Bible. And so there's still churches that will not use the creed, even if they would agree with every statement made in the creed. For example, in the Love Inc. movement here in Church-Sheboygan County, we say, you have to be able to say that the Apostles' Creed describes the core of the Christian faith, whether or not you use the Apostles' Creed in your church. And there's some churches that say, okay, we sign on even though we don't use that creed. Now, interestingly, we've had one church in town that has the creed in their prayer book say, we can't say that creed, and so we can't be part of Love Act. That's more an issue of internal church discipline and polity, it would seem, but so it goes. So at any rate, you get 28 bishops condemn Hopkins and his book, and that's going to take us into the second half of this milieu, but we'll take about a 5-minute break. Well, let's keep going. We're in the midst of the second ritualist controversy. And here we are, and General Convention comes together and does not explicitly condemn ritualism.
What year was this?
This is going to be around 1871. And so we've had 28 bishops go on record publicly condemning Hopkins' book, but now General Convention gathers and does not explicitly condemn ritualism. And so we have a reaction. We get the Assistant Bishop of Kentucky, who leads a party which forms the Reformed Episcopal Church in 1874. That church is still around, has its own seminary, is now within the overall umbrella of the ACNA. And the ACNA, as a result, has some interesting opportunities for common mission. They've got the Anglican Province of Christ the King, which is very strictly Anglo-Catholic. They've got the Anglo-Catholic Church of America and the Reformed Episcopal Church under one primate. So it's God does have an interesting way of calling people back into common mission. In 1871, what the House of Bishops does do in General Convention is to make a couple pronouncements about things. And we're going to take these apart. The episcopacy, having bishops, is plene esse, but not bene esse. Now, what's the difference? Bene esse would mean that something is essential. Esse refers to being. Bene is beneficial, good, whatever. And so you can't have the church without it. Bene esse. Plene esse means it's better. And so the identity, the being of the church is improved by episcopacy, but you could have a church without episcopacy. This is contrary to the position taken in the English Civil War. Charles I and William Laud essentially lose their heads to maintain the idea of episcopacy as necessary for the identity of the church. So think of plene esse as something that's good and beneficial, and bene esse as something that's necessary and essential. And what the House of Bishops says in 1871 is that we like episcopacy. We think it's beneficial, but we can have a church without it. Now, does that sound a little Calvinistic? Yes. And they go further and say that priesthood is royal but not ontological. What do we mean by that? Well, we talked before about, leave aside baptism and Eucharist, the dominical sacraments, as we talk about ontological change in the elements of Eucharist and in the person, the being of the person baptized. If we're looking at priesthood, whether or not we define holy orders as a sacrament, we could sit there and look at priesthood as something functional or ontological. So we could train you to be a priest and take any layperson and give them the necessary training and knowledge and have them function as a priest pastorally and at the altar. And if they did it right and had the necessary knowledge, they'd be a priest. This is a functional view of priesthood that is common in a lot of churches. The opposite view would be that the calling down of the Holy Spirit, the laying on of hands, changes the being of the person who is made into a priest. They are ontologically changed. What the House of Bishops says, deacons as well, bishops as well, holy orders. What the House of Bishops says is, and notice the language they're using here, priesthood is royal but not ontological. So that immediately tells you they're going back to biblical language in 1 Peter. And this is still part of this Reformation sola scriptura focus. This is still a Calvinistic Protestant church, the majority of the Episcopal Church. The altar does not involve a sacrifice. What does that immediately tell you about sacramental theology? This is
Mere presence.
This is symbolic. When we say, do this in remembrance of me, we're saying we're doing what Jesus did. That it's symbolic, it's not real. A very Calvinistic Protestant view. Jesus is not present in the elements. Now, this does not necessarily deny the real presence of Jesus at the Eucharist, but it's the idea that Jesus is present in the assembly, that he's present somehow, because the Bible says, I'll be with you when 2 or 3 are gathered. But you wouldn't venerate the elements, because the bread is bread, the wine is wine, it's not body and blood. There'd be no elevation, there'd be no genuflection, there'd be no even head bow. Baptism involves regeneration independent of moral change. In other words, your being is changed. There is an ontological thing going on there. But this doesn't mean that you're just going to become a good person. You still have to work at it. So, in one sense, that's throwing a bone to the position of ontological change. But when you focus on moral change in the person, you're saying it's really kind of up to how you respond and how you give your heart to how God reveals himself through Scripture. So here we are in 1871, and the House of Bishops basically looks like an assembly that would not be too far disagreed with Oliver Cromwell. But there's a reaction. We talked about a pendulum, right? Now, why would there be a reaction amongst other reasons? Who's been doing most of the mission work in the Episcopal Church? We talked about this last time. Most of the mission work, most of the church planning has been done by the Anglo-Catholic Party. With Jackson Kemper running around out in Minnesota. You get the people running out of General Seminary. That's where most of the mission work is happening. There is no real mission work coming out of, say, the Virginia Theological Seminary, because it's focused on the way things are done in Virginia. To this day, well, maybe within the last 10 years it's changed, but 10 years ago, if you were a faculty member at the Virginia Theological School, in holy orders and wanted to wear chasuble at the altar, that required a unanimous vote of the faculty to allow you to do that. It was cassock, surplice, stole. The reaction results in a canon at General Convention 1874 known as the ritual canon, which basically says ritualism is tolerated. A bishop cannot depose a priest for genuflecting. There's a debate about that at the time. Candles on the altar. We saw what happened to COVID, right? So ritualism will be tolerated. Now, the laity actually are more open to elements of the Catholic revival than are the priests and bishops. And in part, this is because of the mission planting focus and that whole idea of, the beauty of holiness and things of that sort. By 1904, the canon on Eucharistic adoration will be dropped. Remember, in the English church, John Mason Neale was deposed, inhibited from holy orders for 21 years because of Eucharistic adoration. He put the Eucharist in a monstrance, and he was inhibited for that. The Episcopal Church in the 19th century, a bishop may well have charged you with something if you'd had Eucharistic adoration, benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. That is dropped by canon in 1904. And so what we start seeing emerging is what's called the broad church movement. Look at the date here, 1874. Same time that General Convention is adopting the ritual canon. The same time that the Reformed Episcopal Church is breaking off and saying, no, we will be separate. The broad church movement is basically organized around the American Church Congress, which is outside of the established hierarchy. It's not part of General Convention. It's not part of the House of Bishops. It's not part of the House of Delegates or House of Deputies. Philip Brooks at Trinity Wall Street is promoting a comprehensiveness in the church. There's a reaction against narrow evangelicalism and Calvinism that would condemn somebody for having candles or Eucharistic vestments. There's a reaction against an insufficient conception of the incarnation, both in terms of Eucharistic theology and what happens at the altar, and in terms of the church as incarnating Jesus in the world, not just being a society for the elect, the frozen and chosen. Both and, right? The Broad Church Party, there's some other names in here. You get the Bishop of New York. You get some other names here that are sort of the General Seminary Circle. Because remember, General Seminary is very instrumental in the whole Catholic revival in the Episcopal Church, which is considered an anti-establishment liberal position in the 19th century Episcopal Church. They want to enter into dialogue with modern science, for example, because what's happened in 1858? Darwin, the origin of species and the descent of man. And there's been a huge reaction to that. We saw Pope Pius publishing the Syllabus of Errors in 1864. We've seen the reactions in the Church of England. All the churches have reacted to Darwinism. And the Broad Church Party says, well, these aren't necessarily in conflict, so let's talk about it. What we take kind of for granted in the Episcopal Church now, that there's nothing in the theory of natural selection that contradicts the creation account in Genesis 1, is a radical position in the 19th century. Higher criticism. The way we've been teaching our Old Testament course has followed higher critical methods. Well, that would be a radical position in the 19th century. You're supposed to say, this is what the Bible says. You might argue about translations. You might argue about text traditions, but you don't argue about, for example, whether or not Peter wrote 2 Peter, or whether or not Paul wrote Hebrews, or whether or not the differences between the Gospels are explained by something other than, how the witness received the dictation. So higher critical methods start entering the equation as well, and what results is the idea of the Episcopal Church as a bridge church in America. That you've got a Catholic party over here, whether or not they're Roman Catholics or something else. You've got an evangelical party over here, whether or not they're Calvinists or Pietists. And the Episcopal Church starts being identified as safe, the bridge between the different parties of the church. The Rodney King gospel, can't we all just get along, right? How do we, sit there and agree on stuff and say what's core? What makes you a Christian, whether or not we disagree on different elements of doctrine? Now, for example, what have we done in Love Inc.? We've said, as described in the Apostles' Creed, this is kind of a reasonable summary of the Christian faith. Who Jesus is, who the Father is, who the Holy Ghost is. But we really disagree on all kinds of elements of doctrine, over Eucharist, over baptism, over things like that. And that's okay, we still say we're Christians. That's the emerging model that the Episcopal Church starts identifying herself with in the broad church movement. And so we get an important book here, The Church Idea by William Reed Huntington. Now, if you go back and look at Philip Brooks, if you go and look at William Reed Huntington, all these people are now, unless their feasts or fasts, you find them on the calendar. The Church Idea is a very influential book that gets talked about in a lot of churches, not just the Episcopal Church. And he says, we're working, all of us, towards the perfected church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that we confess. The church has to be visible. The church has to be in the world. The church is the place where the Spirit dwells, and therefore there has to be a focus on unity, and there has to be the capability of perpetual renewal. You can't just say something was decided at this council and we're done. Your hand is up for a question.
And he's talking about the gathering of people, church, that concept of being a body.
Yes, we're not talking about a building or an institution here, but the ecclesia, the gathering of the people in Christ's name. So one of the principles that emerge, that become, this is what you have to sort of be to be the church. Well, the first is that Scripture is the revealed Word of God. The second is that the creeds, and he names all three. He names the Apostles' Creed, and the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. Now, he doesn't name the Athanasian. I have to go back and look at that. The creeds are the rule of faith. I've got the prayer book here. I can look it up.
No, that's great.
The two dominical sacraments of baptism and Eucharist are what's important. You can argue as to whether holy orders or matrimony or extreme unction of the sick, or, that was an oxymoron, unction of the sick, or confirmation, or what's the other sacrament?
Marriage.
I said that, matrimony. Well, you can argue there are 7 sacraments, or you can argue there are just 2, but you have to say these 2 are sacraments. And the historic episcopate in apostolic succession. Now, alarms go off, right? That means that going back to the 1871 General Convention that said, or the House of Bishops said, that the episcopacy was plene esse but not bene esse. This book identifies the episcopate as bene esse. Now, this book becomes the formula for proposed church union. If you were to take out your prayer book, you would find on page 876 and 877 what is called the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral, 1886-1888. The first refers to a resolution adopted by the House of Bishops in Chicago in 1886, and the second refers to Resolution 11 of the Lambeth Conference in 1888. And basically they take the four ideas of the church idea here and say, that's what you need to be the church. Those are the necessary elements. So actually what the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral identifies is the Nicene Creed. What it says is the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament are the revealed Word of God. The Nicene Creed is the sufficient statement of the Christian faith. The two sacraments, baptism and the supper of the Lord, ministered with unfailing use of Christ's words of institution and of the elements ordained by Him. Those are the sacraments. And the historic episcopate, locally adapted in the methods of its administration to the varying needs of the nations and peoples called of God into unity of His church, you need that. If you put together that with the Lambeth Resolution of 1888, you get the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral. So, what else is going on at the same time here? As we're sitting there and talking about what's really necessary to be the church and how do we start identifying as sort of a bridge church that can bring people together, at the same time, with immigration and the Industrial Revolution, there is the social gospel arising. That we're supposed to go out into the world and change these horrible conditions around us and the economic injustice around us. So how do we worry about identity as the Episcopal Church to start with? And proposals are made in General Convention to drop Protestant from the title of the church. Right now, what is the church called in our day and age? The Episcopal Church. Up until 2003 or 2006, the church was called the Episcopal Church of the United States of America. Before that, the church was called the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America. So we went from PECUSA to ECUSA to TEC. And TEC arose because of the fact that we recognized, amongst other things, that we have dioceses and provinces that are not in the United States. What's the largest diocese of the Episcopal Church, population-wise?
Dominican Republic?
Haiti. Second largest is Texas, but the largest diocese by population is Haiti. So if you look at the current focuses of the national budget of the church, saying above and beyond all the stuff we need to do, what are our real priorities in mission? It's about how we're identified as the Jesus movement. It's about environmental stewardship. It's about social justice. And it's about support for the Diocese of Haiti following the earthquake and now hurricane.
Those are the what?
If you look at what came out of the most recent General Convention as marks of what we're really focused
So the
on.
mission
Yeah.
statement maybe right now? I didn't know there was a focus on Haiti.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
In terms of allocating any extra funds that become available,
Right.
where's that money go?
You certainly have been pounded
Yeah, again.
again.
So, here we are, and that idea of dropping the name Protestant doesn't succeed. But the church starts getting positioned as sort of an American Catholic church. Safe. Catholic in the sense of broad tent.
Big C.
The effort does not succeed. Now, they use big C here, but the idea is more small c. The effort does not really succeed, but we do begin work on the National Cathedral. Dioceses become smaller. named after the Sea City as a center for liturgy, mission, and education. Now, look at our own history here. We start out with the Diocese of Wisconsin. And then in the 1870s, right when this is going on, we get the formation of the Diocese of Fond du Lac, Milwaukee, and Eau Claire. This is saying that if the historic episcopate is important, it's got to be tied into the parishes. It can't be that you only see the bishop once every couple of years when the priests gather. And that there has to be an actual presence. The reason the Sea City in Fond du Lac is chosen, the location for Fond du Lac as northeastern Wisconsin is, that's where all the railroads cross. So if you're going to get anywhere, you're going to go through Fond du Lac on the railroad at the base of Lake Winnebago.
The kind of part of the reason why Eau Claire and Fond du Lac didn't merge, because it was like, once a bishop and
Distance.
go to all those places.
Right, there was a problem with the idea of the merger. Now, one of the reasons why the diocese moved, not its cathedral see, but it's where the bishop is, to Appleton, was the center of gravity changed. Not everybody's traveling by railroad. They're going through the Fox River Valley in a car. And that's now the center. So the same process is still going on. You start out with the Diocese of Pennsylvania being the entire Commonwealth. The Diocese of Pennsylvania now only extends about, 30 or 40 miles west of Philadelphia. And then you've got central Pennsylvania, northwestern Pennsylvania, Erie. You've got a couple other dioceses. There are a bunch in New York. There are a bunch in Texas. There are states that have single dioceses are actually the minority. Mississippi, Wyoming, Utah. No, there's western Kansas, Alaska. And so if you've got a very, Iowa, if you've got a very dispersed population, you still tend to have, a single see city, and there are issues. Montana's one diocese, that's kind of, But how are you going to afford a second bishop in Montana? It's not going to happen. It's a critical mass issue. Huntington, same guy, Willie Reed Huntington, is pursuing liturgical reform for enrichment and comprehensiveness in use. And so we get the 1892 Book of Common Prayer, which is the first revision from the 1786 book, or 1789 book. It adds the Feast of the Transfiguration to the calendar. It adds the canticles that we use in morning and evening prayer. They weren't part of it before. There were only psalms. There is flexibility in office and how you do the daily office. There are prayers for mission and for church unity. And so when we sit there and pray, keep watch, dear Lord, with those who were... He wrote that. A lot of those prayers we like so much are written by this guy, yes.
What was the office like prior to the flexibility?
Much more like you would find it in the 1662 prayer book, which is just, here's how you follow these psalms, and how the lectionary interacts with it was much narrower. How you could put in an optional canticle, you couldn't. How you could change prayers for the circumstance of what's happening in the calendar or the life of the world around you.
Sure.
No, just here's the way to do it. Now, the number of people actually saying the office, of course, is very small. But as it starts becoming more flexible, it becomes something said not just by priests and religious. This is making it more lay-friendly. The 1892 book is not a serious revision of the 1789 book. The 1928 book will tweak the 1892 book, but not make any serious changes. The 1979 book is going to be radical change. The net effect of this comprehensiveness, however, is to advance Anglo-Catholicism, because it just becomes a safer church for the Anglo-Catholic movement. And since they've been more active in mission and church planting, you start seeing an increase in the Anglo-Catholic party in the Episcopal Church. Now, what percentage of the Episcopal Church could ever be identified as Anglo-Catholic? Small. But a very influential group for most of the history post Civil War stuff. And so the 1979 prayer book would not be possible absent that long-standing Anglo-Catholic influence and absent the Second Vatican Council. Because the Vatican Council ends up as being, you know, the dog is wagging the tail on the rest of the church here in terms of liturgical reform. That whole liturgical reform movement really starts gathering steam in Roman Catholicism in the 1920s and culminates 40 years later in the 1960s in the Second Vatican Council. Michelle?
And I'm just switching base.
As the frontier continues to move, Kansas to Utah to so on and so forth, then merges with California and stops there. Is there a difference in the church regarding the East and West Coast in that sense, or is it kind of, a lot of these themes that we're covering here is kind of all the way through, or is it still very much focused on the East Coast and the Midwest?
The Episcopal Church is very much an East Coast phenomenon for most of its life.
Okay.
Until you start getting a lot of money on the West Coast and in Texas. And then Texas, for example, starts really punching above its weight in church politics, the South in general. The sort of cultural Christianity that is more prevalent in the Southeast means there's more money for the church there. And while it's still headquartered in New York, and you still tend to see presiding bishops elected out of, you know, northeastern dioceses and coming out of General Seminary or the old Philadelphia Divinity School or the old Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge. There is this gradual shift in center of gravity. What goes along with that is that as dioceses are established in the West and as churches are established in the West, it depends on who establishes them. So you might think of Wyoming as kind of like rugged individualists, and that might correlate with the idea of a frontier preacher, but they're a lot more Catholic than, say, you know, the Diocese of Alabama. And it's because that's how they had churches established. So there's kind of a hodgepodge there. Really, it's almost like in Africa, you see, was this place evangelized by the SPCK or by the SPG? Is it a Catholic or Protestant province? Similar effect, less extreme contrasts in the American church, partly because there's more of an idea of just an American identity than, you know, a church party identity. Moving on then, we see the National Cathedral here, right? Technically called the Cathedral Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, but always referred to as the Washington National Cathedral. Now, just as I said in the 19th century, early on, Missouri said the Catholic Church couldn't own property. Run this one by a constitutional lawyer now. The cornerstone is laid in the 1890s. The building actually starts being built in 1907. The cornerstone is laid by the President, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and this is pursuant to a charter granted by the United States Congress to establish a national house of prayer. Can you imagine what would happen if you tried that now?
Yeah.
Which makes it a little easier to swallow how unchristian it tends to be.
Yeah, the National Cathedral, if you are, let's be careful. The National Cathedral is considered by many in the broader church to be kind of loony lefty stuff, right? Michelle's point is, that kind of puts us in a different context. It's always been established with that cultural reference being part of the fabric of the place.
Well, you go to the bookstore, you can find books from many religions.
Right. It's about spirituality, right? It's sort of a national house of prayer.
If your careful words were loony lefty, I'd like to know what your uncareful words are.
Well,
It was still righty-tighty when I was living there.
that was a while ago.
Like 70s.
That's an age in the church right now. Okay, now, we're going backwards again into the post-Civil War developments here and concerns, because this sets the stage for how the church engaged with the society. If we look at the war between the states, or the War of Northern Aggression, as Elizabeth would refer to it, if we look at the Civil War, we would describe it as the Second Revolution, the establishment of the Second Republic. All the stuff that wasn't settled in 1787 gets settled now, either through the price of blood or through Reconstruction political policies and power. What emerges, we had Jacksonian Democrats and Jeffersonian Democrats and waves and whatever. What really emerges now is an industrialized urban America being in charge. Capitalism is freed from restraints. That whole debate over the Bank of the United States, that's ancient history now. Americans espouse a sense of virtue and destiny, manifest destiny, for example. Faith is expressed in republicanism, the national religion, which is that sort of army Protestant I talked about earlier, and capitalism. We get a population increase here in 40 years from 31 million to 76 million. Six-fold increase in urban population. Chicago goes from 100,000 people to 1.7 million. Progress is a sign of divine favor. This is the gospel according to Andrew Carnegie. The gospel of wealth. The self-made man, the rugged individualist is the ideal. And Mark Twain labels this as the Gilded Age. Who are the heroes? Well, Ulysses Grant, self-made man. Herbert Spencer is the thinker here. He takes The Origin of Species and the Descent of Man by Charles Darwin and turns that into social Darwinism. And so if you're like a ne'er-do-well in a slum, that means that you haven't evolved properly. And we have to put in place there are two ways that social Darwinism cuts. As a conservative reactionary force, it's saying people are in slums because they're not as good as the rest. As a liberal force, it's saying we have to apply evolutionary forces into that environment for people to move on from that environment.
Is that like the beginnings of eugenics?
No, but eugenics will grow out of that very much. Social Darwinism from the conservative side of saying there are inferior traits in the population will result in eugenics coming to the fore in the 20s particularly. We have to remember that Margaret Sanger, who is considered, sort of a sainted figure in the whole Planned Parenthood movement, was all about eugenics and addressed the Ku Klux Klan convention in Indiana in 1921, talking about, selecting out inferior races, and that the Third Reich got most of its eugenic policies from the state of Indiana. So, I mean, there's an interesting history there that doesn't get talked about too much. So Herbert Spencer is sort of promoting the idea of social Darwinism, and this is the idea that if you're successful, you're supposed to be successful. You're successful because you're a superior being. We're not looking at your environment, what privileges you had growing up, and whether you've got a trust fund. You're successful because you're a better person. Now, I mean, think of the 80s. Think of the 90s in this country and all the go-go capitalism when junk bonds went nuts. If you remember the ads for Prudential Investments, there'd always be some guy on an early cell phone on a speedboat going around about, Americans want to not just survive, they want to succeed. Same message. There is an explicit connection made between success and Christian living. Sound familiar? This is the prosperity gospel. God wants to bless you. You're supposed to have a big house. You're supposed to have the wife with the big, chest. You're supposed to have the big car. You're supposed to have the perfect kids because you're faithful. God wants to bless you. Same thing. There's this connection made between success and Christian living. I hope what you're noticing here is that none of this sounds unfamiliar in our day and age. religious spokesmen are complacent. Hey, why rock the boat? Things are good. So the Episcopal Church, 1874, another statement out of General Convention. Be content with your wages. You know? How's that sound for social justice in the modern Episcopalian context? Dwight Moody, we talked about the whole revivalist movement and the Moody Sankey hymns and the Moody Bible Institute. God has blessed this nation. That's going to be a sermon that becomes very popular. But then there are problems. We get all these upheavals that shake this complacency and this simulacrum of faith. We get the 1887 railroad strikes. Now, when we think of a strike now, even in Sheboygan, where we had the longest labor strike in American history, and there was gunfire, that's kind of ancient history for Sheboygan. But when we think of a strike here, we think of, there are guys on the street with signs and people aren't working. In the 1880s and 1890s, when there's a strike, it's like a battle. And so the railroad strikes result in, what do? You call in the National Guard, the militia, you call in the police. They open fire on strikers, things like that. Strikers trash towns. You get the Haymarket riot in Chicago in 1886. People get killed. The Army fires on the strikers. You get the Carnegie Steel or the Homestead strike in 1892. Google the Homestead strike, and what you'll find is an image on the Susquehanna River or the Allegheny River, I forget which one, but it's the big steel plant where we ended up with the Pittsburgh Steelers football team, where the Pinkerton Agency is hired as a private army to come down the river on barges, armed with Winchester repeating rifles to break the strike. What do the strikers do? They set up artillery and start bombarding the barges and set them all on fire. Capture all the Pinkerton men. There's a battle with cannon and rifles. That's a strike in 1880s, 1890s. The Pullman strike in 1894. People who've been looking at sort of inevitable progress and God has blessed this nation and there's an explicit connection between success and Christian living are going like, something's wrong with this picture. This doesn't look like progress. There are also the pennies dropping on the fact that the strikers, whether you agree with their methods or not, have some real grievances and are human beings that Jesus Christ died for. They're not abstractions anymore. They're not those social Darwinist abstractions of less successful people who, by the way, happen to be immigrants, who might not be good, solid Americans in the way we define good, solid Americans. So this shakes the church, and in the process of shaking, we see the Christian social movement emerge. And the Episcopal Church is the first to welcome this. The Christian social movement is basically where you sit there and say, the gospel has to go out into the world and it has to make a difference in people's lives. Now, before we move on, I've got some pictures here from what we just reviewed in terms of Philip Brooks, the Broad Church Movement, and William Reed Huntington, the Church Idea, and the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral. But I would commend to you to read pages 876 and 877 in your prayer books. And I'll point out that the whole idea of the Lambeth Conference, which only starts in the 1880s, in fact, this is the first one, 1888, that's an idea that emerges from the American church. Huntington and others built around the church idea say, how do we get all these Anglican churches to act as one communion? Well, why don't we recognize the Archbishop of Canterbury as sort of a primus inter pares, and we'll all come together every 10 years and gather as bishops, and that idea comes out of the American church. It's now a century after the Revolution, and people are not worried about the church being identified with Englishness. So the idea of gathering with Anglican bishops and with the Archbishop of Canterbury is not deemed threatening to the identity of the Episcopal Church. It's also because the Episcopal Church is starting to look at elements of foreign mission, and they're encountering other Anglicans around the world and saying, how do we work together? In the course of the Gilded Age here and all this go-go capitalism and the emergence of the Christian social movement, let's talk for a minute about developments in American theology. Because remember, Catholic theology throughout this time period is not distinct in theology in America. There's a Catholic identity that's different, but not a theology that's different. There's a teaching magisterium out of Rome that establishes what Catholic theology is. So any of the developments in American theology are a Protestant phenomenon. And we get three important movements in American Protestantism post-Civil War. Liberalism, and we'll define that in a minute, don't think of it in terms of political liberalism. Fundamentalism, and neo-orthodoxy. These are going to be the three movements that will dominate American Protestantism to our own day. These are the three movements that we're still sort of in the midst of. What are the characteristics? Well, despite the differences in these movements, each bears a relationship to Americanism as understood by a majority of Americans. How do we understand that? Well, until recently, when we started celebrating multiculturalism and pluralism more, we think of American culture as unified. The American way, truth, justice, and the American way, or Superman, right? And so there should be, or maybe even is, harmony between the secular and religious elements in society. To the extent that there's pluralism, what it means is that distinctive traditions and identities are non-threatening. Kind of, but to the extent that we're not dealing with anti-Catholic prejudice, the fact that somebody's a German American or an Irish American or an Italian American starts being less of a big deal, as long as they're American. As long as they're a good tax-paying American participating in the progress and patriotism and all the things that are important to us.
In the late 1800s?
Starting in the Gilded Age here, yes, post-Civil War. Now, this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
Because we're going to see Catholic prejudice in 1960 presidential election, right? We're certainly going to see it in the 20s when Al Smith is running against Calvin Coolidge. I mean, the reason he basically loses to Calvin Coolidge is he's a Catholic. And, the preachers get their folks out in force to say we're not going to have popery in the White House, something like that.
I was 9, 10, 1960.
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, it was an issue
Big
in
time.
Maryland when John F. Kennedy was running.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, Maryland is completely different now, and Virginia is not your grandfather's Virginia.
Right.
But certainly then it was an issue.
It was an issue.
Big deal in Mississippi.
Right.
Yeah.
Huge.
So it's not like these prejudices go away, but they're against a background of an American identity, which gets really cemented by 3 wars. First you get the first you get the Indian Wars and its manifest destiny, how we're going to, take this as the promised land. And that's sort of a white identity that, there are battles over Reconstruction in the South, and they get resolved basically with Jim Crow laws, separate by equal. Then you get the Spanish-American War, and America now becomes a world power and starts having what looks like an empire. And so there's an American identity of it's our duty to go out into the world and do something about what's wrong. Then, of course, you get World War I, and we're going to make the world safe for democracy, and we get a very Presbyterian minister sort of president preaching a gospel of democracy. And then, of course, you get World War II, where we're fighting literally evil empires, but there's the great melting pot of things like the draft. And you get all the movies coming out of Hollywood where priests are kind of, good solid figures like Father Flanagan in Boys Town, or when the Sullivans are killed on the USS Juneau, how they're depicted, and that sort of Irish American identity starts getting celebrated. We're now to the point, if you look at priests on film, they started as good solid, people who get things done. Then we get to the point where they become kind of slippery characters. Then we get to the point where they're kind of evil, corrupting youth sort of thing. And now we're to the point where priests are either evil or just figures of fun. They're kind of comical figures, and nobody takes them seriously in Hollywood. Well, for a long time, they were taken very seriously. If you look at the Spencer Tracy movies and things like that, or Bing Crosby. So that anti-Catholic prejudice doesn't go away, but it's managed within that background of a quote-unquote unified American culture. Can't we all get along? Because we're all focused on making money and extending Americanism. Faith, here's where we go back to that initial contrast we made between individualism and transcendentalism. Faith is a personal and inward phenomenon, not an ecclesiastical or institutional phenomenon. It's kind of dominant now, right? Spiritual but not religious. Or the number of people who self-identify as Christians, self-identify as Christians, but don't belong to any church. They're called nuns now, N-O-N-E. That's an identifying factor in American Christianity for a long time. A church is an institution. We don't talk about the church, capital C, so much as my church. I belong to a church. And a church is an institution formed by voluntary association and fellowship. Opt-in, opt-out, voluntarism. Theology is focused on the personal, inward elements of belief. Faith and religious identity are defined not in systematic theology, but in praxis. How do you live? What do you do? Not how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, to take a ridiculous example. Not on Eucharistic theology, not on ontological change, but how are you living? Are you living a good Christian life? Now that became part of the language, right? He's a good Christian man. This is going to be pilloried by Upton Sinclair. It's Babbitism, amongst other things. It's all about success and business and being successful. And we've all seen church congregations in various denominations where if you are a business owner in town, you join that church because that's how you make the right business connections. Or you join that church because that gets you into the right country club. This is still a phenomenon in the Southeast where there's more cultural Christianity left. Incidentally, just as an aside here, speaking of cultural Christianity, the data that came out from the Church Pension Fund the other day on how the pension plan is changing are kind of interesting. It turns out now that if we look at the traditional model that the pension fund is based on, that is that you are a priest employed full-time in a parish. 44% of Episcopal clergy now fall in that model. They're the minority. The majority model is either you're employed on more than one church, or you are employed in something outside the church, or you're bivocational, and there are regional variations on this. And so if you look at where we sit in Wisconsin, the majority of Episcopal clergy in the Midwestern region are not employed full-time by a single church. They're mainly bivocational. If you look at the Northeast, they're mainly working between a cluster of churches. The only part of the United States where it's the traditional model, the majority, of you're a priest in a church is the Southeast in Texas, where there's still that remnant of cultural identity of what church do you... I mean, you still go to a small town in Mississippi and people will ask you what church you belong to. You don't hear that in a lot of the country. So we see here religion, if it's defined by praxis, by how we live, it's a pragmatic religion, oriented ethically, right living. good Christian living. Character and behavior and social attitudes are interdependent. Theologians are, in effect, ethicists. They're not speculating about various mysteries of the sacraments. They're talking about how you're supposed to live. And if you go in our library here, you'll find, shelves full of books that are kind of self-help that way, right? How are you going to get this together and be a better Christian? The social, secular context of life is accepted. In other words, all creation is not fallen. There's a lot of good in the world. Now, we recognize that, of course, but God's plan is being brought to fruition, and a promised land is realizable. We can transform our society. We can make this the city on the hill. An aside here, but a necessary corollary, monasticism is rare. If you're going to, make this into the city on the hill, you're not going to be in a religious order in a cloister somewhere. Religious life is oriented to the secular. Faith has her face turned to the world. That's a positive, right? But there's little emphasis on the transcendent. It's about how you're supposed to live. Reality, truth, and value can be found in the observable world. Well, we agree with that. It's a question of emphasis, though, right? It's like, how are we going to go out into the world and find what's good and build on it? So there are positive aspects to this, certainly. The creative element in theology is engaged with the culture and is relevant and alive. What's the negative aspect? There's a close identification of religion and culture, and this gives rise to the danger of nationalistic spiritual pride. Part of the ugly American image overseas arises from a moralism that is an outgrowth of this. If you go back and look at European movies in the 30s and 40s and 50s, what's the movie Never on Sunday? The American's kind of a stock character who, he's around the Greek prostitute, but it's not really clear that they're sleeping together, and he's a good clean-cut guy, and his name's Homer. It's like, that's how Americanism starts getting viewed by Americans and by Europeans, that you're a good, clean-cut guy. And that's what it means to be a good, church-going, God-fearing American.
There was a pastor, and probably 20 plus years ago now, a black pastor, one of the mega churches in California and everything. It just popped up in my brain about it. He said, one of the things, wow, that's interesting. He said, you know what? If you don't have insurance, get out of my church.
Whoa.
I said, you say you're a good, positive Christian, but you're driving around without insurance.
Yeah, it becomes a matter of civic duty. Now, if you look at the Crystal Cathedral in California, it's that, it was that success model. It's now a Roman Catholic church, actually. It went bankrupt. If you look at Norman Vincent Peale and the power of positive thinking, it's all about how they're winners, and they're winners because of how they live and how they, espouse these certain core principles of life. If you want to have fun, go Google an article that appeared in the magazine First Things in August, I think it was, might have been July, and it's called Donald Trump, Man of Faith. And it basically reviews Donald Trump's upbringing in the Marble Collegiate Church on the Upper West Side in New York City with Norman Vincent Peale as the preacher. And that what Peale was preaching is a lot of what we're hearing in the presidential campaign about how you have to focus on success, and if you don't, you're a loser, and that we just need to pass you by. Now, I don't want to, in a deacon school here, characterize a political campaign. All I'm suggesting is that you might read the article to look at the parallels drawn there between the type of preaching that grows out of this movement and how we see it reflected in the broader culture, including in a political campaign. So there are positive and negative aspects to these developments in American theology, and liberalism becomes allied with the social gospel. Therefore, the individual and society are perfectible. We got to work on making this a better place. Now, liberalism per se here, don't think of social liberalism, political liberalism, although they tend to ally. Liberalism in the church is saying, we can talk about evolution. We can talk about biblical criticism. We can engage in colloquies with people in other churches where we don't agree about sacramental theology. We don't have to sit there and wall ourselves off. That's liberalism, capital L, in theology. But it becomes very much allied with the social gospel, and we're not going to, this class, talk about fundamentalism and neo-orthodoxy, because they are big topics in and of themselves. We're going to talk about how liberalism shapes very much how we engage with the world. If we, for example, say that Charles Darwin is of the devil and the Bible is to be taken literally, well, we're going to engage the world a little bit differently in terms of looking at how an environment affects an individual. We're going to sit there, and a lot of fundamentalist churches are really good at social outreach, really good at social programs, because they're focused on how this individual is going to give his life to Christ, and he's going to change himself by following Jesus Christ. Nothing wrong with that. But the message being preached is not that he's in this situation because of his environment. He's in this situation because of his moral failings. So again, don't hear me as saying that theological liberalism is a bad thing. There are degrees of everything here. Fundamentalism, we'll talk about this next class, but fundamentalism grows out of what is initially known as Princeton theology, which is a theology around the seminary at Princeton University. And as things like evolution and biblical criticism start coming forth, just like we saw in the Oxford movement, we had tracts for the times. Out of Princeton, you start getting tracts being published, pamphlets, and they're called the Fundamentals. Now you can buy them collected as a book. There are 90 of them. Just about the same number as the tracts for the times, so do the math. The fundamentals will sit there and say something like, one of the fundamentals is the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it will make a detailed biblical argument about how you cannot be a Christian if you deny the bodily resurrection. Now, I think everybody in this room would say you have to believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. So again, when we say fundamentalists now, we tend to paint with a broad brush and say, wackos from our perspective. You have to go and look at the actual fundamentals. Now, where we would start diverging in view would be when we look at the authority of Scripture and how it would be interpreted. We don't view it as being dictated by the Holy Spirit word for word, each word infallible, right? That would be one of the fundamentals. That would be a pamphlet on the authority of Scripture. What we have here, though, is liberalism starts now because we have the idea of the perfectibility of society. We need to look again at mission. And so what does missionary outreach in America look like? Well, recalling from our 17th of September class at the Episcopal Church, the most active missionary church planting was not from any church party or heritage with any established heritage. It tended to be the Anglo-Catholics. What developed in the post-Civil War era in missionary outreach is our question. We also just talked today about how the church is viewed and experienced as a means to establish moral order on the frontier. So, where are we going with this? Where we're going is that missionary outreach is identified with theological liberalism, the social gospel, and the settlement house movement. We're going to do a little background before we start picking those apart, though. We start out and we see that Roman Catholicism in America is focused on defending against nativist hostility, the anti-Catholic prejudice that the Irish and the Italians and the Germans run into, or that the church herself runs into. The Catholic Church is also focused on resolving her own internal struggles that basically come about because of Pius's syllabus of errors. There's a struggle over, where the Catholic Church identifies herself now in terms of modernism, in terms of scientific progress, in terms of how things get taught. Missionary work in America is focused on church planting targeted to existing and expanding Catholic population centers. So they're building a lot of churches, but it's because of Irish immigration, Italian immigration, German immigration. These enclaves are becoming broader and new Catholic churches are arising as a result, but it's not a mission to non-Catholics. They're not engaged in mission work to non-Catholics in general, with exceptions to these rules. Then we get Leo XIII. In 1891, publishes an encyclical, Rerum Novarum, Revolutionary Change, and he incorporates a new teaching on social responsibilities. It's kind of revolutionary in the Catholic Church, based on where the church has been in the 19th century. Socialism is condemned, but so is unrestricted capitalism, the Gilded Age. Labor has a right to organize. The church hasn't said that before. The wealthy have an affirmative duty to the poor. The church hasn't said that before. Now, Jesus has said something a lot like that in Matthew 25, for example. But you haven't had the church saying in a papal encyclical, this is a focus of life in the church and of her identity. And if you're not doing this, you are not being a faithful follower of Christ. That's pretty revolutionary. Lutheranism in America is focused on assimilating immigrants. A lot more Germans coming. What's the peak time for German immigration? 1890s. A liberal theological framework is focused on social and ethical improvement. We talked about that already, and targets the disadvantaged. This is where you take a parallel development to the whole slum priest movement of Anglo-Catholicism and say, how do we improve the life of these folks? And how do we improve these communities? Particularly active are Congregationalist churches in this. They're the ones that are most focused on missionary outreach in this social gospel. There's a focus on social improvement, but, moving on, we get the social gospel resulting, as I said, in theological liberalism. The moral and rational powers of humans must be given a broader scope than creedal confessions. Sin is considered to be primarily error or dysfunction. This isn't a focus on the fallenness of the world. This is a focus on how we make things better. And so even if we were to take an extreme example and say, well, the fact that you keep helping that person materially is enabling bad behavior, it would still be about the corporal work of mercy of helping the person. The focus in missionary outreach is therefore primarily teaching. Show those in error a better way to live, without a primary focus on the confessional content of the faith. Now, in all parishes, in all congregations, there are a lot of good Christian folk sitting in the pews who can't describe a lot of the content of the faith, right? And that's mainly the fault of the church that we haven't catechized them the way that we should. We also have people, good Christian folks sitting in pews, who became a church member because their lives were messed up. And somebody reached out to them and showed them a better way to live, and that got cemented in church membership. This should be celebrated. We should give thanks to Christ for this. It's not the same thing as saying when somebody attacks your faith, how you can defend it. You can just say, well, it works for me, but that goes right back to that personal American way of being, rather than saying, here's the nature of being, here's the nature of this supernatural reality of creation. We're focused more on ethical preaching, moral education, because the human capacity to choose the good is emphasized. So, this is not the same thing as classic Calvinist tulip theology. Remember we talked about that back when we were in the Reformation. Tulip was total depravity of the human being. Unlimited atonement. No, wait a minute, that's wrong. Total depravity. Unconditional election. Unconditional election. You're either saved or you're not. You're predestined. Limited atonement. Not everybody's saved. Irresistible grace and perseverance of the saints. Those are the bedrocks of Calvinist theology. Tulip. Well, if you're going to preach that, you're not emphasizing the capacity to choose the better. You're going to sit there and say, here we are, it's the way we're made. Once you start talking about the capacity to choose, you see how that comes out of theological liberalism. You can say you can choose a better life. Now, that better life is going to involve gathering on Sundays to cement you in this faith, in this better life, but you can actually choose. You can go to somebody who's in a horrible environment. The fact that they've been in a horrible environment isn't going to determine their destiny. Sound familiar? I mean, this is what we do a lot in outreach, right? The settlement house movement, you can capitalize that if you want. The goal of the movement is to get the rich and the poor in society to live more closely together in an interdependent community. The main object is the establishment of settlement houses in poor urban areas in which volunteer middle-class settlement workers live, hoping to share knowledge and culture with and alleviate the poverty of their low-income neighbors. The settlement houses provide services such as daycare, education, and health care to improve the lives of the poor in these areas. Now, I actually proposed this model to Love Inc. When the Methodist Church sold the rehabilitation center over here, which is now the dormitory for corporate interns, I said, let's raise a couple $1 million and establish a settlement house of transitional housing so that as Love Inc. walks beside, churches in Love Inc. walk beside people coming out of poverty, they've got a place to live and see a different way to live and not be stuck with a slumlord and, they're going to be there a year, and then they're going to move into their own place. And there'll be people who live in that place that, are examples to them and how we work together. Kind of like what Martha and Mary, the Guild of Martha and Mary is doing in this parish. So we're probably in a situation in our society where a lot of this stuff is going to have to come back. Wouldn't be the worst model in Sheboygan. Prominent in the settlement house movement, as I say, are the Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Episcopalians. The teachings of Rerum Novarum from the Pope and the settlement house movement will coalesce theologically into the Catholic worker movement centered on Blessed Dorothy Day, who didn't die until the 1980s, but was principally active to the end of the World War II era. And so the Catholic worker movement is all about social justice and the dignity of labor and how you have to provide for a living wage for the head of a household. Now, the head of a household is deemed to be a man who is married, and he and his wife have children together, and the wife stays home. And so you have to provide a living wage for the husband to support the whole family. Now, for decades, that was the economic model in this country. That's kind of fallen apart now, and we're seeing the damage as the model either readjusts or breaks, depending on how you want to look at that. The settlement house movement is to sit there and say, well, there are folks who just don't know how to do this, and so we're going to teach them. And we're going to do that by walking alongside them and living with them. Domestic missionary outreach is primarily a phenomenon driven by independent Christian ministers planting congregations on the frontier. You don't see an active mission board from a denomination doing this so much. There are mission boards. We have Jackson Kemper appointed as a missionary bishop by the Episcopal Church. The Baptists have a mission board. The Presbyterians have a mission board. But most of the congregations that get established is a preacher shows up in town and starts collecting a flock, and they eventually build a church. The theology is broadly Protestant. It will become more specifically fundamentalist or Pentecostal post-World War I when we start talking about establishing independent churches. Major denominations will not really focus much on domestic mission in any organized fashion pre-World War II.
Which is odd with the Depression. You think they would?
Oh, there are people running soup kitchens, and there are a lot of people doing charitable work, but sitting there and saying, we're going to go out to these folks who are in bad shape and try to convert their lives, not so much. There's kind of a quid pro quo. If you're going to show up to the mission and get fed, then you're going to sit there through a church service and sing some songs. Or the Salvation Army band's going to come through. I mean, if you look at the musical Guys and Dolls, all the guys down in the Bowery are going to the Save a Soul mission, and before they get fed, they have to sit there and listen to Brother So-and-so preach, and now we're going to sing this hymn. I'm not criticizing that model. I think the fact that people have to show up and do something is a pretty good model rather than just getting something free, But
we saw as children that
Yeah.
had the downtrodden, end up in the Salvation Army and comes out a better man, and leads the way for others.
Right. Again, that goes back to that American individualism and how you can be a self-made man. Maybe you need a hand out from the church, a hand up from the church, but you can do it. Mission work, therefore, is pretty much still an independent thing, not churches going out and doing it. Post-World War II, baby boom, we're going to see such a population explosion that people just start building churches and denominations get very involved in that. That's not so much mission. Where they're going to focus on missions overseas. American missionary work becomes principally overseas missionary work. Now, here are some leaders in the social gospel. You get Walter Rauschenbusch, who wrote the book that really kind of defines all this, A Theology for the Social Gospel. You get Josiah Strong, who wrote the book, Our Country, Its Possible Future, and Its Present Crisis. These books are very much focused on the church going into the world and preaching changes in the society based on the economic inequalities that exist and the moral depravity that's identified. But it's about going into the disadvantaged areas and changing lives. Vida Scudder, prominent in the settlement house movement. Vida Scudder is the only woman to receive an honorary degree from Nashotah, or the first woman to receive an honorary degree from Nashotah House, which she received in 1942. And it caused a bit of a flap, not so much for Nashotah House, but because Lord Halifax had been packed off by Winston Churchill to be British ambassador to America, to the United States. Because Churchill wanted him out of Great Britain. He'd been considered an appeaser who could potentially be set up as a Nazi puppet. When he showed up in the United States, this was also that the British government had agreed that the FBI keep tabs on the British ambassador. And he was to come to Nashotah House in early 1942 to get an honorary doctorate. And his train was intercepted by the FBI in Chicago because there was a radical socialist at Nashotah House, Vida Scudder. So, Halifax didn't actually show up to receive his honorary doctorate. And then, of course, you see Dorothy Day over here, who, as I say, lives into the 1980s. If you see pictures of Dorothy Day in a stained glass window in a Catholic church, she tends to be an old lady, but she was a young firebrand for a lot of her activity in the
That's pretty smart.
Catholic workers movement. Yeah, and she's 19 years old in this picture.
Just like, why you take my picture, I got work to do.
Right, so,
It was also traditional not to smile
well,
in photographs.
I can't do it either. I can't smile in the photo.
All evidence to the
So let's talk to the American church in foreign mission here. Prior to World War I, foreign mission activity by American churches is very limited. Missionary activity is generally confined to the planting of churches in the country as the frontier gets tamed. That's where we're doing mission work. There are isolated examples of mission activity in resettlement schemes of former slaves in Liberia, in the Pacific Islands, and in China. China becomes a particular focus for organized mission from the Presbyterians.
Japan, too.
Yeah. And so Japan's a little bit more of a Catholic phenomenon, really, but not so much an American phenomenon, but China becomes a particular focus, and you get the missions sort of either growing out of the Bund in Shanghai and going up the rivers, or particularly around Chongqing and places like that. They're part of the American spheres of influence. The Philippines, of course, become an additional focus for Protestant missions following the Spanish-American War. Now, there is, as early as 1814, the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society, and it does conduct organized work in Burma, but it's on a very small scale. So American missionary activity prior to World War I is very fragmentary. Where it's going to take off is after World War II as we enter the American age. Foreign missions are pretty much exclusively a Protestant enterprise. Foreign missions from the Episcopal Church. Now, just to contrast to the Roman Catholic Church there, foreign missions in the Roman Catholic Church are not from dioceses, archdioceses. They're from religious orders. So again, you've got the Franciscans, the Jesuits, the Premonstratensians, the Dominicans, they're doing a lot of mission work, but the church in the sense of, the Archdiocese of Milwaukee or the Catholic hierarchy of the United States, that's not happening. Foreign missions from the Episcopal Church are focused initially and primarily on the translation of Scripture into other languages. A lot of this comes out of the General Theological Seminary again. So we get Blessed Samuel Shadashevsky, who worked in Japan and China, became bishop in China, is on the calendar in lesser feasts and fasts for the translation of the gospel into Mandarin Chinese. There is mission work to Native Americans, and in Alaska, the church spreads amongst the Inuit in Alaska. And amongst Native Americans, you start seeing the establishment of formal mission, for example, to Navajo land, which is now a recognized diocese. That's where the Episcopal Church starts heading. Now, after World War I, the establishment of the United States as a world power is going to lead to great expansion in mission activity, particularly in the Pacific. But this is really going to accelerate after World War II and extend into other regions, spearheaded by evangelical missionaries, particularly from Wheaton College, and Pentecostals. Next class, we'll talk about how the Pentecostal movement really starts in 1913 in Los Angeles, and we'll parallel that with what's happening in fundamentalism and how neo-orthodoxy sort of arises in that mix as well. As I said, Roman Catholic mission work involving American churches is through religious orders primarily. So where we end up now is, here we are, call it mid-century, 20th century. And going to church is pretty much being an American. It's the default mode of being an American. It's not so much a conscious choice. It's certainly not a countercultural choice. You can be cultural if you want to be, I don't know, a Seventh-day Adventist or a Mormon or a Pentecostal. But if you're in a, quote, mainline church, you're part of the culture. And we're going to see going forward, not next class, because next class will be focused on the first half of the century. We're going to see going forward how that ends up corrupting a lot of the church. And so the rebirth that we are seeing some signs of is going to look exactly like the rebirth that happened when the church got corrupted before and became part of the culture and established and lazy. And we saw the Anglo-Catholic movement arise, or we saw, a missionary zeal arrive and evangelical preaching and pietism. This is because the church got lazy and co-opted by the culture. By the time we finish mid-century here, that's what's happening to the church, and we just coast along for the next 50 years comfortable. And all of us who are alive today think of this as the norm, that people just go to church and you build churches and it's part of your identity as an American. It is, on a historical basis, an exceptional period. It's not the norm.
When they used to ask what church you could go to, G was a capital letter.
Mm-hmm. Go.
That was the operative.
What church do you go to right now? What do you belong to? What is your understanding of the Christian faith? What is your confession of faith? What church do you go to? Elizabeth?
This Freeman,
Stratensians, the Norbertines, the Abbey of Plymouth. They're here, they're up here in De Pere, the Norbertines. But they're technically called Premonstratensians.
where
Yes.
they regiment?
At the Abbey of Plymouth in
France.
Swiss Alps, the French Alps. The La Grande Chartreuse, yes.
The Eastern Church during this time frame regarding missionary work, are they touching other regions, same regions as far as like Asia and Africa? Are they really contained to the Slavic, Russian?
Yeah, there's not much missionary work. The Eastern Orthodox churches are focused more on ethnic identity. If you were to ask a Russian Serb in the mid-19th century, for example, what are you? If he got off a boat at Ellis Island, he wouldn't say he was a Russian, he'd say Pravoslav Orthodox. That's his identity, not Russian. And so the Orthodox Church in America, there are some Greek elements on the East Coast, but they're small ethnic enclaves. The major Orthodox influence prior to World War I is actually the Russian Church. And it's a wealthy church that is going around establishing churches in the Pacific Northwest and on the East Coast, a little bit around Chicago. But it's, again, wherever there are Slavs gathered. It's still very much it's kind of like the Roman Catholic Church in that way. It will build churches based on where its people gather and populate, but it's not going to go and try to convert somebody else to Orthodoxy or to Roman Catholicism. That's very much a Protestant phenomenon.
Okay. So that's why you don't hear much about, you hear about missionaries in Japan, China, things like that. You're not hearing about that in Eastern Orthodox.
You have in China, you do have Orthodox enclaves, but they're Russian enclaves.
Yeah.
Certainly in Korea, you get a Russian enclave.
So is there a definition for Stratensians?
What do you mean by definition? It's a name.
It's not based on like monstrance?
No, it doesn't relate to a monstrum. It relates to the name of a particular location, Plymouth. And so it's talking about mountains.
Okay.
not monstrance.
Okay, so before mountains.
Saint Norbert. So these are Carthusians, basically. And so, for example, the Norbertines up in De Pere came here originally as a missionary and teaching order in Wisconsin. That's how they got here. They're meant Dutch Norbertines here, almost exclusively Dutch. Now, with the exception of just contemplative orders, all orders have engaged in some kind of mission work. Because you might plant a house somewhere and you build a church around it or something like that. But and early on, the Catholics were much more focused on converting natives than were the Protestants, at least in North America. But the missionary focus of the American church is going to be identified primarily as a Protestant enterprise of all different stripes. So if you watch the movie The End of the Spear, you know, that's post-World War II, that's the Amazonian jungle in Ecuador, and where are those guys from? Wheaton College. You know. I'd recommend that movie. We have it on DVD. We could show it on this thing sometime as a movie night.
We showed it here.
We did a couple of years ago. We might do it again. We've got that, and we've got the mission. We should probably get Black Robe, a couple other things like that. We're
The Apostle.
The Apostle would be a good one. Yeah, Robert Duvall Film Festival. We're going to take a break now and grab some lunch, and then we'll regather and start looking at the Old Testament. Any other questions before we finish, though? Okay.